Welcome to the very first episode of the Soul, Sovereignty, and Sexuality podcast. I am super excited to bring this forth because this is really my soul's calling to talk about what it means to be sovereign, what it means for your soul to be sovereign, to ascend, to embody its truth here and now. This is about embodying your divinity and how we shift our consciousness into our embodiment, into our daily life to experience this. It's not a concept. This is about the how. This is about the why. This is about the actual practices, the actual thoughts, the actual beliefs that we have to shift in order to come back into recognizing our souls here on this planet and living from that place, having relationships from that place, working from that place, eating from that place, the way we treat the earth from that place. And the very first episode is about sex because I want to talk about sex. It was actually a song that I used to love growing up. Let's talk about sex, baby. If you remember that song, really great. Great dance song. So the reason I want to talk about sex is because sex has been turned into an act, something that we do, very transactional. It's about getting off or being wanted or fulfill my desires, demanding, or objectifying, or you're using, or being used, or it's like, oh, well, that thing that I feel like I have to do because this other person wants it. Like for a lot of people, it turns into an obligation or a duty. There's so much to talk about sex. And my biggest grief is that we have taken the soul out of sex. That this happened thousands of years ago. And it's the reason that sex became a sin, which I'll talk more about in future episodes. It's the reason that we are disconnected from our own sexual energy because sex is way more than an act. Sexual energy is something that you get to cultivate within yourself, your ecstatic life force energy, your creativity, your own pleasure, your own desire, your own connection with yourself, your soul. Your sexual energy is so much more than you've been told, than I was ever told. And it wasn't until I started really looking at ancient civilizations and mythology and religious history and studying that and recognizing that things are not the way we have been told they are. They were not always like this. We've been told that the story of Adam and Eve was written and it made sex a sin. Actually, technically, what they said was the sin wasn't sex itself, but the desire for sex. So believe me, we'll be talking a lot about desire and its demonization and the distinction between ego gratification and soul desire. But also, when this became a quote sin, many civilizations had already existed and sacred union was already a thing. Sex was celebrated, revered, honored. But the reason it's so different is that even though we talk about sex a lot in society and there's a lot of misuse of that energy out there, both by men and women, that sex wasn't separated from soul. And that creates a massive difference in how we approach it, how we think about it, how we participate in it. What if sex wasn't something you do, get, or have, but was holy communion? Holy communion. That's what I like to call sex in the context of ancient history, in the context of soul, and embodying our divinity here and now. Holy communion. That you are in holy communion with yourself, with your own soul, your own being, your own body. You recognize the divine within you. You breathe it, speak it, live it, taste it. And you recognize that soul in the other. And this recognition isn't mental, it's felt. And we see this through the eyes of the heart, not the mind. And when you can recognize that within you, you can't help but recognize it in other. And that's one of the reasons why the ancients understood self-knowledge is the key to freedom. It was posted on the ancient Egyptian temples. Know thyself, know thy universe. And as you know thyself, know thy universe, what do you experience? Freedom, eternal freedom. And they knew that when you know thyself, you know thy true self, the soul self, the divine self. And that consciousness, and then therefore the embodiment, shifts everything, especially sex. Your access to your own sexual energy, which is activated as you work with your body as energy, because your body is the energy of your soul, and you amplify your energy, your soul's energy, and release what's not that, which is what I call soul embodiment. I'm an international soul embodiment guide, because that process, it's a journey of primarily releasing all the things that you're not, all the false roles, the conditioning, the inherited beliefs, the ancestral traumas, the soul traumas, the way that that affects you now, because your relationship with yourself is everything. It determines everything else in your life. And as you do that, you begin to reclaim your sovereignty. And sovereignty is also essential to experience Holy Communion. Why? Because if you're not sovereign, sex can very easily become something that you do for very egoic reasons. It can create codependent attachments, unhealthy attachments. It can really lead to a lot of distress. And I'll go more into that in future episodes. But when you are sovereign, you are in touch with your own divinity, your own divine power. When you embody this, not as an idea, but the reality, the truth of who you are, you know your worth, and you aren't giving yourself away. And you're not using sex to manipulate or to get what you want. And this is unfortunately pretty predominant, that that's how we use sex. And sex is a really beautiful, powerful thing when it's not transactional. I can't tell you how many women I've talked to where they think sex is just one person on top or the other, or trying to just fulfill some temporary needs. And we're really missing out on all the other possibilities. And I don't call my work Tantra, because Tantra is very misunderstood also, especially in America and in the West, because Tantra has been sexually commodified, turned into another commodity, another thing that you do or get or have to become. But the ancient understanding of Tantra, which is that unification of masculine and feminine energies within, yes, that. And that unification of masculine and feminine energies within, which again, we'll talk more about in this podcast, is really coming into union with your divinity here in form, which is soul embodiment. And so what I would like for you to at least know in this first episode, I'm going to try to keep them fairly short because I have a tendency to want to share everything all at one time and make things long, is that you can start to look at your own sexual energy not as something you give away or reserve for the bedroom or limit to an act with another person or commodify yourself or make it just this thing you do because you feel pressured or obligated, but instead to start to just be with the concept of what if my sexuality was my own? That's one of my biggest passions that I've taught about and will be offering more teachings about both in groups and on this podcast, because you start to look at that as your own and connect with your sexual energy, your life force energy as something that belongs to you, no one else. It shifts the way you approach life because you become one with life instead of separate. And we, particularly as women, but men and women, were separated from our sexuality being our own when it was turned into an act. And sex was turned into an act of power over when Holy Communion was no longer possible because the soul of woman was no longer recognized. And this happened between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. It took a couple thousand years for this new belief system to be put into place that's now codified in the story of Adam and Eve, because it took that much time to fight and kill the opposition. And the soul of woman was no longer recognized because life was deemed inferior to spirit. We separated life from the divine because women, especially at that time, represented life, earth. We also said that she had no soul and that she was inferior. And this created the power over, and sex as an act of power over something that he was told that he could possess and own. The truth is, even though that has unfortunately been the reality, which grieves me deeply for thousands of years, the truth is that no one can ever own a soul. And you get to free yourself from this. And that's what this is about. You freeing yourself from these inherited beliefs that try to control you, limit you, possess you, tell you what you can and cannot do, what you are and are not, which are lies. So that you can reclaim your divine power, so that you can reclaim your sovereignty, so that you can embody your soul's truth here and now and return to sacred union and experience that holy communion with yourself, with life, with the elements, with your body, and in sex. And that's freedom. Freedom that is not contingent on anything or anyone around you. Freedom that isn't based on things going well or happening the way you think they should. Freedom that isn't even limited to time and space. Eternal freedom. And so I'm very excited to bring forth more of these topics on soul sovereignty and empowerment, sexuality, embodiment with you. You can reach out to me at thepathtosovereignty.com. Go to the website or send an email, jessica@thepathtosovereignty.com, if you have particular questions you want answered on the podcast, or put a comment below, particularly if you're watching this on YouTube instead of the other podcast platforms. And we'll start to dive in. My intention is to do a podcast once a week and keep them as short as possible. 15 to 30 minutes is my ideal, unless I invite some guests on and we'll talk a little bit longer. So I'm excited to continue this conversation and wish you a fabulous, beautiful day.